Once upon a time, long, long ago, I was in Sainsbury's in the UK while I was studying in the beginning of 1990, and I was with some friends shopping. At some point, I went to the children's section and I saw a nice book and I read it. And I decided to dedicate it to my daughter, even though I was only 19 then and I never knew I would have a daughter. Here is the dedication to her from 1990. So now in 2018, I have a 6-year-old daughter called Melissa. And I will read it to you and to her, now that she can speak English. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful princess who was 6 years old. Her name was Princess Terribelle. She lived in a palace with the queen, her mother, and the king, her father, and slept every night on 14 mattresses with 5 pillows. Mostly she was a very good girl, although sometimes she was bad. But I think people loved her all more for that. Now Princess Terribelle had plenty of toys and books and pretty clothes. She was a princess after all, but she still enjoyed going to other people's homes and playing with their toys. One day, as Princess Terrible was finishing her lunch, it was strawberry yogurt, the queen, her mother, said, "Darling Terrible, we are going for tea this afternoon with my friend the Duchess. She has a little girl about your age. You have been invited to play with her." "Good," said Terrible, although she wasn't altogether sure at that moment whether or not she was going to like the Duchess's daughter. She went to put her anorak on. Princess Terrible and the Duchess's daughter, her name was Arabelle, so they had quite a lot in common, got on very well indeed. Arabelle was quiet and Terrible was noisy. Arabelle liked being bossed about, and Terrible was bossy. Arabelle didn't mind if Terrible wanted to be the princess. She was one after all, and she always had to be the witch or the dragon or the toad. They played very nicely together. After tea, Terrible played with Arabelle's dolls. Arabelle dressed them and Terrible made them move around and did the voices for them. She was just persuading Arabelle to change a pink pair of doll's tights for a silver pair when her eye fell on something she had never seen before. It was a pair of dolls' Wellington's boots. Real rubber ones, just like her own. They weren't like other dolls' clothes. More like a pair of boots belonging to a tiny, tiny human being, or a fairy perhaps. Fairy Wellington boots. Princess Terrible stared and stared at them. She picked them up and danced them on her hand, half afraid that she might be clutching at an invisible little being. While Arabelle was busy tugging at the silver tights, Terribelle walked the miniature boots round in circles, round and round, and slipped one, just one, into her pocket. She loved them so much, and she felt quite sure that Arabelle would never miss just one Wellington boot amongst all the other dolls' clothes that filled her cupboards. At 5:45, Princess Terrible and the Queen, her mother, waved goodbye to the Duchess and her daughter and set off for home. That night Princess Terribelle slept soundly on her 14 mattresses with 5 pillows, her hand curled tightly around one tiny fairy Wellington boot. Nobody said anything to Princess Terribelle about the little boot. Not the next day, or the next week, or for so long that she knew she was right in thinking that Arabelle wouldn't miss it. She did feel just a little bit guilty, and in fact, it wasn't much fun playing with only one boot. Besides, it didn't fit any of Princess Terrible's dolls. She didn't even have many dolls, as she usually preferred to play with Lego. Still, it was a dear little boot, and sometimes she liked to balance it on the palm of her hand and imagine the tiny fairy who should rightfully own it. A month or so later, while Princess Terrible was having supper, the Queen, her mother, said, "Darling Terrible, I had a telephone call from my friend the Duchess this afternoon. She would like to bring Arabelle over to play tomorrow. Won't that be nice?" Terrible quickly ran upstairs to the bedchamber and hid the fairy Wellington boot between the fourth and the fifth mattresses. It wouldn't do to have Arabelle noticing it when she had so clearly quite forgotten all about it. Princess Terrible was glad to see Arabelle. They had a nice time playing. Arabelle liked the Lego because she didn't have any herself. Princess Terrible was in a generous mood and shared everything without arguing. The Queen, Princess Terrible's mother, had made butterfly cakes for tea, and Terrible even managed not to mind when Arabelle ate the last one. At a quarter to 6, it was time for Arabelle and the Duchess to go home. Terrible found herself hoping that Arabelle would want to come again, and she began to feel even more guilty about the Wellington boot. And how could Arabelle be friends with someone who stole things? "Goodbye, Terrible," said Arabelle. "Mummy says you must come and play at our house again soon. Oh, and I've got something for you." Terrible watched it in wonderment as Arabelle felt around in her little bag for something. A present? What could it be? The tiny parcel lay wrapped in tissue in Terrible's hand. She looked at Arabelle. "It's the other one," whispered Arabelle. "One isn't much fun on its own. Let's play again soon." Terrible stood on the store bed, her mouth open. She looked at the other fairy Wellington boot. Then she ran upstairs and put it with the other one between the fourth and the fifth mattress. They are probably still there now. Terrible and Arabelle became the best of friends, and Terrible never ever bosses her about.